Hard Merchandise, third in the Bounty Hunter Wars trilogy, has quite a bit to accomplish. Not only must it resolve the dangling plot threads of the previous books, but it also has to resolve the cliffhangers that were left in Slave Ship, the previous one. How will Fett survive being ambushed by Prince Shizor at Khudar Mubat's web? Will Neela, the amnesiac dancing girl, regain her memory? Will Boba Fett find out who is so eager to kill him, and what will he do when he finds out? What of the machinations of Kuat, all of which are geared toward the preservation of Kuat Drive Yard's autonomy? More importantly, the question is, can Jeter stick the landing having set all of this up? Let's find out. Once again, we have a past and present timeline, but the past one is actually pretty short, so we'll conclude that first. We resume the past storyline with Fett flying through hyperspace to Khudar Mubat's web to deliver the bounty of Trihin Vosant, the renegade stormtrooper. The funny thing was, despite being on his way to a terrible fate at the hands of Palpatine, Vosant seemed unusually cocky. And while Fett put most of this up to mind games, there was a part of him that was beginning to wonder if maybe the stormtrooper knew something he didn't. Fett's instincts proved to be quite correct, as Prince Shizor had a small fleet around Khudar Mubat's web waiting for Slave One to emerge and blast it to bits. As he stood on the deck of his flagship, the Vendetta, the leader of Black Sun was thinking about Fett, this lethal prey that was about to be ensnared in his webs at last. I get you're trying to build suspense here, Jeter, but as we all know at this point, Fett outlives Shizor, so is there really any point to that? Especially dragging it out over so many pages, dedicating so many words to Shizor's mental self-congratulation? Well, at least it's in character for the bastard. And certainly the Faline Prince came closer than most to killing Fett. Slave One was indeed targeted the instant it emerged from hyperspace, and the first volley from Black Sun almost became the last. The damage was so severe that even Slave One's sophisticated built-in auto-repair systems couldn't handle it. Fett's struggle to keep his ship in one piece was certainly not helped by the fact that Vosant tried twice to kill the bounty hunter even as the ship seemed like it was going to collapse around them. First, he tried to brain Fett with a bar from the cage he was kept in. Secondly, after Fett managed to haul Vosant up the crumbling ladder from the lower decks of Slave One to the cockpit, the stormtrooper literally tried to kick Fett back down again, and the bounty hunter managed to succeed only by using his smart rope to half-strangle Vosant into submission. And by this point, Slave One had lost nearly all of its oxygen, so both men were struggling just to stay conscious. Having subdued his hard merchandise, Fett assessed the situation and realized that he was really screwed. Slave One had no weapons, no shields, and barely any power left in its engines and maneuvering thrusters. But Fett was ever resourceful and managed to pull a solution of sorts out of his helmet. He managed to maneuver Slave One so that it put Khudar Mubat's web between it and the Black Sun forces, and then raced for the web as fast as the engines could go. Even as badly damaged as it was, Slave One's maneuver was too quick for Black Sun to target. Of course, the brakes on Slave One didn't work, so that meant Fett essentially crashed it into Khudar Mubat's web. And remember, Khudar Mubat's web is not comprised of spider silk, but of the alien's own extruded neural tissue, essentially brain matter. And so, crashing Slave One into it was the equivalent of giving Khudar Mubat a severe concussion. The assembler was still recovering from the damage by the time Fett had dragged a surly Vosant in to collect his payment. Shizor and some guards arrived soon thereafter, but of course, Fett being Fett, he'd managed to get the drop on Shizor and hold him at gunpoint before either guard could react. But one does not become the leader of Black Sun without nerves of steel, and even with his neck in an arm lock and a blaster pistol resting against his temple, Shizor remained calm and poised as ever. He freely admitted to using Fett as a pawn to destroy the Bounty Hunters Guild, and how he had used Vosant to drive home that destruction. He also admitted to planning to kill Fett with his little fleet, because after all, the bounty hunter knew too much and thus was a loose end and a potential threat. However, Shizor had recently been persuaded to let Fett live. Balance sheet Khudar Mubat's accounting subnode, and now a fully independent entity, had, by the time the prince had arrived, persuaded him that it was better that Fett live. He could still be useful in the future. Shizor had decided to take him up on that offer and enter into an arrangement with Balance Sheet, which of course meant terminating the arrangement with Khudar Mubat. After all, there was only room for one assembler go-between in the criminal underworld. Fett was not happy at being used as someone's cat's paw, but in the end, he was here to collect the money for Vossant. As long as he had the credits, he could live with that, at least for now. Vossant remained surly and defiant up until the point that Fett pointed out that if Shizor, and Palpatine for that matter, were willing to kill Khudar Mubat and try to kill Fett in order to cover up their involvement in the breakup of the Bounty Hunters Guild, where did that leave him exactly? By knowing about the plan, he was just as much a loose end as Fett. Unlike Fett, Vossant wasn't nearly as useful anymore. As realization dawned on him, the undercover stormtrooper commando could only stammer that after all he'd done loyally for Palpatine, it wouldn't be fair. To which Fett replied, "You're going to discover that Palpatine is the one who decides what's fair and what's not." With that, the credits were transferred to Fett's account, and he turned and walked away. By the time he'd returned to the battered Slave One, Khudar Mubat was in the process of being killed by Shizor's minions, and the neural web and all the subnodes were dying around him. For unlike Balance Sheet, they had remained extensions of Khudar Mubat. Fett had barely scraped through this one, but he had come away with the money. Or at least some of it. Balance Sheet revealed as he departed in his own little vessel that after transferring the credits for Vossant to Fett's account, he'd swiped half of that amount, considering it expenses for convincing Shizor to let the bounty hunter live. After all, a spider needs startup money for his own ventures. Fett vowed revenge, but Balance Sheet was unimpressed. Now that Khudar Mubat was dead, he was the all-important middleman. A little too important and too useful to kill. With that, the past storyline comes to an end, and we come to the present storyline. We begin with a scene that seems irrelevant at first, but does become important near the end of the story, so bear with me on this one. Or rather, bear with Jeter on this one, it's his book. It's pretty short and straightforward. Zuckuss and the bounty hunter droid 4-LOM tracking a mark. The mark in question? A somewhat fat human named Draumas Smada, a gambler by trade, who has made quite a bit of money by being excellent at predicting the odds of whether or not the Empire or the Rebellion will win a given conflict or skirmish. Unfortunately, Smada has gotten so good at this that the Empire has begun to suspect that perhaps he has inside sources. And so, they've surreptitiously put a bounty on the gambler, willing to pay top credit for any hunter that can bring him in for questioning. Now, Smada frequents a bar where the policy is you can bring your blaster, but you leave their power packs at the door. Luckily, Zuckuss and 4-LOM, though mostly 4-LOM it must be admitted, found a way around this. The droid commissioned a specially modified power pack, swapped it into the space where the droid's motivator would normally be, thus smuggle the power pack into the bar, then pass it to Zuckuss so that he can have his blaster fully charged in order to hold the gambler at gunpoint and frog march him out of the bar. Of course, that meant 4-LOM would be powered down the moment he gave it to Zuckuss, but hey, they could just get a replacement from one of the serving droids. No great loss. However, the principal purpose of this scene, aside from introducing Smada, because again, he is important later on, is to have Zuckuss musing, somewhat gloomily, on the history and fall of the Bounty Hunters Guild. Like many young hunters, Zuckuss had chafed against the rules and restrictions the guild elders had imposed on all of them in their profession. But now, years after it's gone, he finds that he misses the guild in some ways. But in the end, Zuckuss eventually comes to the morose conclusion that the bounty hunters have no one to blame for the guild's destruction but themselves. Fett was simply the catalyst, the excuse they'd all been looking for to tear the whole thing down. And with that, we turn to the principal trio of our story aboard the Houndstooth. Boba Fett, fellow bounty hunter Dengar, and Neela, the amnesiac dancing girl, who at this point has gotten fed up with all the waiting for answers that never seem to come. She'd helped save Fett's life by dragging him clear of the pit of Carcoon after he'd blasted his way out of the Sarlacc, and yet ever since, all throughout the previous book in fact, she has alternated between trying and failing to get anything out of the bounty hunter and listening to Dengar's account of the bounty hunter wars. All throughout, a little mental war has been going on inside Neela's head, whether or not she would be better off taking her chances and killing Fett and flying off to find the answers for herself. Attempting to reason with Fett or even, laughably, try to threaten him has gotten her nowhere, and she absolutely hates how powerless the bounty hunter has made her feel from the get-go. The fact that he seems to hold all of the cards and that she can do nothing about it. At this point, she is halfway tempted to drawing her blaster and firing, not caring whether she kills Fett or if the bounty hunter just kills her. And here is the best writing Jeter pulls off in this entire trilogy. Because this is the scene that truly gets to the essence of Fett, what makes him so deadly, and thus what has made him so popular among fans. As such, I'm going to mostly quote this scene because it is just that good. Neela's hand is straying towards the blaster pistol when Fett breaks in, reminding her that whether or not she or he dies, she'll never know. She will never know who she really is. He is still the only link to her past. Then he turns around and takes out his own pistol and throws it to the deck. Now you don't have to worry about whether it would cost you your life. The only one that's at stake is my own. The text then reads, quote, "The lack of any perceptible emotion in his voice only made it clearer to her. The same thing she had known from the beginning. Boba Fett didn't win by sheer violence or the brutal efficiency of his weapons. The force of his will and his understanding of other creatures' thoughts were just as annihilating." In fact, Fett spells this out earlier in the scene, saying, "My business is to reduce other creatures' options." Despite this, she draws the pistol, aims it squarely at the visor of his helmet, and yet she still can't bring herself to fire. "You win," she says, conceding the point. Of course, there was little doubt of that. You might not know who you really are, and I might not know either. That's something you haven't determined. But I still know more about you. I know how your mind works. You have to win here and here before you have a chance of winning anywhere else, or even surviving. That's why the others lost, I suppose. Like Bosk, you were able to take his ship away from him just because of what you were able to do inside his head. Exactly. Something like this, it just makes things final. Sometimes. But by then, the battle is already over. Of course, we all know that Fett isn't invincible or unbeatable, but it really drives home the idea that in Return of the Jedi, it was literally blind luck that sent him down to shake hands with the Sarlacc. Having lost yet another verbal sparring match with Fett, Neela ends up going back down below to listen to the last bit of the past storyline from Dengar, after which she returns to the cockpit and finds that Fett has finally reached his destination, the web that had once been the abode of Kudar Mubat, the Assembler. And at last, the bounty hunter is ready to tell all. First, he reveals that Dengar's relation of the bounty hunter wars to Neela was actually his plan all along. One, it helped bring Neela up to speed on events relating to Kudar Mubat, which would soon prove to be relevant, but it also helped keep both of them out of Fett's helmet while he plotted a circuitous nav route to the location of the web. He'd made it circuitous just to make sure that he might throw off any tails that would follow him. At any rate, he orders Neela to bring Dengar up from below, since he doesn't want to have to explain himself twice. Time is of the essence, as it is quite literally the eve of the Battle of Endor. Anyone with an ear to the ground knows that a big conflict is shaping up, and its outcome might well decide the fate of the galaxy. Fett surmises that the Empire is more likely to win, but if it does, it won't be very easy for bounty hunters, as Palpatine's ultimate desire to control everything will make things very disagreeable for free agents like those in the bounty hunting profession. If the rebels win, which Fett regards as almost but not quite impossible, their pretensions to high-minded morality will mean that the rates for bounties will go down, and the rebels might actually make an effort to stamp out the criminal organizations that are often the best-paying customers of bounty hunters like Fett. From his perspective, the most ideal outcome would be for Endor to result in a stalemate. At any rate, events are afoot in the galaxy, and Fett wants to make his explanation as succinct as possible. Some years ago, before Khudar Mubat's death, Fett had been coming back from another completed job when Slave One's computer had pinged him. Fett keeps a database of all known bounty hunters in the galaxy, whether affiliated with the guild back then or otherwise. And that database was informing him that one of his colleagues was operating in a system that was otherwise normally empty of traffic. That was unusual and potentially profitable, so Fett had gone to investigate. He'd found, drifting in the void, the Venisectrix belonging to one Duptum, an especially disreputable figure even by bounty hunter standards. This being the days when the guild was still around, Duptum had the distinction of being one of the few bounty hunters actually expelled from the guild. Apparently, Duptum sometimes sold disinformation on the side when he wasn't pursuing bounties, and one such piece of disinformation had gotten 2 members of the guild killed for crimes they hadn't committed. Fett boarded the Venisectrix and found Duptum dead. He'd never been good at maintaining equipment, and apparently the engine on his ship had suffered a reactor leak. Duptum had succumbed to radiation poisoning, leaving behind a corpse even less lovely than he'd been in life. After scouring the Venisectrix for anything that might have been valuable, or potentially valuable, Fett had come away with 2 things. 1, a modified cargo droid containing a recording of the stormtrooper attack on the Lars moisture farm on Tatooine, and a pheromone sample belonging to a male of the Phaline nobility. And given that at this point in time there was only 1 member of that family left alive, that meant it was Prince Shizor's. Only 2 possible explanations for this strange bit of evidence had occurred to Fett. Given that by now Luke Skywalker had cemented himself as a hero of the rebellion, everyone knew at this point that the Lars farm had been his home and that it had been destroyed as part of Vader's attempt to recover the plans for the Death Star. So, either Shizor and Vader had been working together on this operation, highly improbable given their mutual hatred, or that someone had been trying to frame Shizor as being involved in the murder of the Larses. At this point, Fett still has no idea who that could have been. The second thing he'd found aboard Duptum's ship had been Neela, on the verge of death from cold and hunger, as well as suffering the trauma of a recent but very thorough memory wipe. Fett was unable to find from the ship's computers where Duptum was taking her and why, but there was still the chance that she might be useful and profitable to him. And so, after nursing her back to health, he had stuck her in Jabba the Hutt's palace for safekeeping. Jabba's court being a crossroads for all manner of scum and villainy, Fett had put Neela there in the hopes that someone visiting the Hutt might recognize her and thus give him a lead. And so, while Neela had struggled to survive in that viper's nest, grappling with her lack of memory while also trying to avoid becoming some low-life sex slave or being thrown to the Rancor, Fett had been keeping an eye on her whenever business had taken him to Tatooine. But at last, he finally found a fish ready to bite. An otherwise unimportant criminal who had been until recently business partners with Duptum. After employing various methods of persuasion, Fett was able to find a faint, tenuous lead. Duptum's erstwhile partner had had no idea of who Neela was or why Duptum had been hired to transport her, nor did he know who had hired the bounty hunter. What he did know was that whoever had done so had not hired Duptum directly. They'd used a middleman. From there, Fett had jumped to the obvious conclusion, though not the only one, Khudar Mubat, the assembler. And that was why he had brought the Houndstooth to where the assembler's web, or what was left of it, still floated in the void. Neela points out angrily that this is completely pointless since Khudar Mubat is dead. Then Fett surprises her and Dengar by simply saying, all they need to do is bring the dead back to life. Boba Fett is a very, very thorough man, and at one point he decided that it would be to his advantage to know as much as he could about Khudar Mubat's species. So, after some searching, he at one point discovered that there were in fact other assemblers besides Khudar Mubat, indeed an entire homeworld of them, and it was there that he learned some very important details about assembler physiology. Namely, that the cerebral tissue that assemblers like Khudar Mubat extrude to produce their webs can be artificially revived. And so, with the help of a creeped-out Dengar, Fett manages to piece together the biggest chunks of Khudar Mubat's web, reattaches the corpse of the assembler to the web, and then, using power cables from the Houndstooth, essentially Frankensteins Khudar Mubat and his web into a semblance of life. Pretty cool, but annoyingly pointless. The reconstruction of Khudar Mubat's web is incomplete. There are just too many tiny fragments floating around out there to be assembled. And as a result, conveniently, there are gaps in the undead assembler's memory, including any idea of who hired Reduptum. Before Fett can take the interrogation any further, someone arrives and begins shooting the web back to pieces. Fett and Dengar only just make it back to the Houndstooth before the web collapses around them, exposing them to the vacuum of space. Dengar, in fact, almost doesn't make it, and only through Fett dragging him along does he survive. In this way, the Mandalorian repays Dengar for saving him back on Tatooine. It turns out the unexpected guest was Balance Sheet, Khudar Mubat's former subnode. And funnily enough, while he had come here to destroy his progenitor's web, he'd also come looking for Fett. What happy and plot-convenient coincidence that he only needs one trip to accomplish both ends instead of two. When they go aboard the little assembler's freighter to meet with him, Fett is none too pleased. Although Balance Sheet assures Fett that he wouldn't have found the information even if he hadn't come along and blown it up. As a former subnode, Balance Sheet could integrate himself with the web of Khudar Mubat, and had picked over all information contained within his progenitor years ago, so nobody knows who hired Reduptum to transport Neela. However, Balance Sheet has found out on his own who is responsible for the fake evidence against Shizor, and the one who tried to kill Fett via orbital bombardment on Tatooine. As it happens, they are the same man, Kuat of Kuat. What's more, Balance Sheet has struck on an opportunity for both him and Fett to make a lot of credits. The reason Kuat wants Fett dead is because of the fabricated evidence against Shizor. Evidence that, if exposed, could give Palpatine the excuse to take over KDY by accusing Kuat of treacherously working against someone who had been a trusted member of his court. Thus, Balance Sheet reasons that with him acting as go-between, Fett can basically contact Kuat and offer to return the evidence in exchange for a hefty fee. This way, both the assembler and the bounty hunter get rich, and Kuat loses his principal reason for wanting to kill Fett. The problem is, Fett doesn't have the evidence with him. He left it aboard Slave One, and according to recent developments, it was taken into custody by the Rebel Alliance. But Fett's been out of the loop since he left Tatooine, and Balance Sheet reveals that in fact Bossk possesses that fake evidence. Recall back in the Mandalorian armor, Bossk had found Slave One floating in orbit and had rifled through it before confirmation had come that Fett was alive. After Fett scared him off the Houndstooth with a fake bomb, the Trandoshan has been lying low in Mos Eisley. He knows that the information he took from Slave One is valuable and is looking for someone to sell it to, but he still doesn't yet know just how valuable that information might be. Still, time is of the essence. They need to get to Tatooine and get the evidence from Bossk before he sells it. Otherwise, they lose their principal means of getting money from Kuat of Kuat. And it certainly doesn't help when Balance Sheet's freighter's sensors detect a ship entering their little corner of space and positively identifying it as a KDY security vessel. Fett, at the very least, needs to get to Tatooine and recover the evidence stat. Luckily, since Balance Sheet had been preparing for this deal, he brought along someone to make sure that Fett could get there quickly. The Houndstooth, while good, is no Slave One. And what's more, a lot of people will be gunning for Fett at a moment where he is relatively weak. And so Balance Sheet has employed for this purpose Indru Sulak, the hunt saboteur from Slave Ship. The swiftly hashed out plan is that Dengar and Neela take the Houndstooth and flee, drawing the KDY ship after them, while Sulak takes Fett in his modified headhunter to Tatooine and back as quickly as possible. Sulak is happy to do so, one, because he'll be making a lot of money from this deal, and second, he appreciates the irony of having to smuggle in someone who is his professional enemy, especially when it's the only bounty hunter that ever got the better of him. Neela accepts the deal but is not especially happy with it, mainly because Fett still remains her best chance of staying alive long enough to reclaim her memories. What the others don't know, however, is that she actually has made some progress in doing so. While Fett was telling his story, the name Reduptum unlocked a memory. Not her name, but rather a skill set. She remembered that she used to be a technician. Of course, she kept this a secret from Fett, recognizing that any information she knows that he does not can be a potential advantage. And so, while Fett and Dengar had been trying to resuscitate Kudar Mubat, she had gone through the computer aboard Houndstooth, and here this might be a bit of a plot hole, because why would Fett have uploaded this to a ship's computer not his own, when she finds a reference to the only other name that she remembers from her past apart from her own, Nil Possendum, the accountant that Fett had captured way back when. And in the file, she discovers a picture of the image that Possendum had scratched into the floor of his cage aboard Slave 1. And that image had unlocked another memory. She still didn't remember most of her past, but now she remembered her real name, Katil of Kulvalt, scion of a Kawati aristocratic family. The only reason that Fett had never recognized the symbol as such is because that particular symbol Possendum had created was an old one used back in the days before the 10 ruling families of Kawat had adopted individual crests for their houses. All three parties go their separate ways, Houndstooth leading the KDY ship after them, and despite a brief dogfight with another bounty hunter en route, Sulak does indeed manage to get Boba Fett to Tatooine in a timely fashion. Which of course brings us to Bossk. And he is not a happy Trandoshan. Ever since Fett managed to scare him off the Houndstooth, he's been loitering around Mos Eisley, trying to find a buyer for the strange bit of information that he found aboard Slave 1. But as if it wasn't bad enough that Fett has humiliated him for the umpteenth time, Bossk, in his dealings with the criminal element, has begun to notice no one's scared of him like they used to be. Very few people are respectful of him, despite the fact that he was and still is one of the best bounty hunters in the business. It's just that Fett is in a whole other league. And it's slowly dawning on him that after all his failed attempts to get one over on Boba Fett, he might have finally reached a tipping point. Trandoshans are not the most civil species in Star Wars, and Bossk has always been a particularly nasty example. As such, he has made his own fair share of enemies. And now, after being bested and humiliated by his great rival, again, Bossk has realized that he's essentially starting to turn into the butt monkey of the bounty hunting community, and that now a lot of old enemies that otherwise wouldn't have dared might now be seriously thinking that it might be time to take a piece out of him, figuratively or otherwise. Naturally, Bossk being Bossk, he pins the blame for all of his misfortune on Fett. And so, by the time the Mandalorian bounty hunter arrives in Mos Eisley, Bossk has made a resolution. By now, he knows the value of what he's got, but he hasn't sold it to anyone, and he's not going to, because the only person he wants to sell it to now is Fett. He literally makes that offer to him. Pay top credit for the evidence. This isn't just about money, this is about vengeance. Bossk knows at this point that he can't kill Fett, but there is one way at least that he can make his hated enemy pay, which is to literally make him pay. Fett hates being parted from his money. If nothing else, Bossk can take some satisfaction in the idea that Fett had to part with his money to give to him. Of course, Fett being Fett, he simply ups the ante in a way by pointing a blaster pistol at Bosk's head and saying, either you give me the information or I shoot you here and now. Bosk's counter-arguments have no effect on him, even when he points out that if Fett kills him, Bosk doesn't have the information with him. And even if Fett can find on his own where Bosk hid it, that will take time. time that Fett doesn't have at the moment. But Fett simply counters that is at worst an inconvenience for him. For Bossk, though, it would be fatal. And as the Trandoshan stares down the barrel of the blaster pistol, he has an epiphany. He is literally on the verge of giving in, but then he simply says no and dares Fett to shoot him. If he can't in fact part Fett from some of his credits for the evidence, he is, in this moment, happy to let Fett shoot him and thus waste time finding the information on his own in a final act of petty spite. And then, incredibly, Boba Fett blinks first. With much irritation and bad grace, he transfers the credits to Bossk's account. The half-stunned Trandoshan then mumbles out where he hid the false evidence. It turns out it's just in his hovel under the cot he sleeps on, and a disgusted Fett walks away, grumbling that he should have saved himself the credits. He walks out, and then the Cantina patrons who had watched the confrontation with bated breath cheer and applaud. Never before had they seen anyone stare down Fett and walk away the victor. And it's only then that Bossk realizes that he's finally won. It was a small victory, a petty victory, but it was victory all the same. At a single stroke, he has not only managed to get one over on Fett for once, he's actually restored his reputation as a bounty hunter. Fett and Sulak do make it back to Dengar and Neela at the prearranged rendezvous point, right at the moment that the KDY security ship still in pursuit manages to somehow disable the Houndstooth. Afterwards, Fett examines the Houndstooth and discovers that in fact it was a special device that KDY had planted inside it for just such occasions. He figures that it's standard policy of theirs to take out any ship, either one that they made themselves or one that they modified or repaired. A just-in-case sort of thing. Of course, no such device ever existed aboard Slave 1 because Fett knew, and in fact told, the KDY staff that ever touched his ship as much that he would search it with a fine-tooth comb, so they never bothered placing one. The same likely also applies to the Imperial Navy. They're not completely incompetent after all, and Palpatine certainly would not tolerate the idea of Kuat being able to disable his ships at a moment's notice. Sulak promptly cuts and runs, figuring that no amount of money is worth getting killed over. The Houndstooth is boarded, and the boarding party is led by Kodir of Kolvolt, the new head of security for KDY. The exchange goes pretty much like you would expect. Kodir basically says that if they hand over the fake evidence, then she'll let them live. Outnumbered and outgunned in a small confined space, Fett decides not to contest the matter. And then Kodir decides to bring Neela along with her, saying cryptically that she might have answers for the amnesiac. Most of Neela's memory is still missing, but the sight of Kodir convinces her that she knows this other woman, and that the memories associated with her are not pleasant. Dengar can only watch disheartened as that last big chance at a big score flies away. But of course, Fett is undeterred. Immediately, he begins looking for and disabling the device that took out the Houndstooth, fully prepared to pursue them to Kuat itself. Nobody, not even Kuat of Kuat, takes from Boba Fett without paying. Only two more things to talk about and we will have reached the climax of hard merchandise. First, remember Dramas Smada, that fat gambler Zuckuss and Forlom took into custody? Well, he's recently emerged from his questioning by the Empire, shaken and angry at the bounty hunters for capturing him, but otherwise alive. A mysterious woman approaches him and offers to make a wager, though that wager is not specified. Hold on to that thought for the very end. The second is what's been going on at KDY this whole time. As stated earlier, it is the eve of the Battle of Endor, and Kuat of Kuat, chairman of Kuat Drive Yards, has been receiving some unusual visitors from the Rebel Alliance. Not all Rebel forces were amassed at Sullust for the big push to Endor. By order of Mon Mothma, a starfighter squadron named Scavenger Squadron has been sent to Kuat. basically to assess which way the winds are blowing with the industrialist and make it clear to him that whatever he decides, they're going to do everything in their power to make sure that the Empire does not claim the new batch of Star Destroyers freshly manufactured and ready to go in Quat Drive Yard's dry dock facilities. As if Quat of Quat doesn't have enough to worry about. What with Boba Fett still on the lam with that highly compromising piece of false evidence he'd made against Shizor. When his own network of agents had finally informed him on where the bounty hunter might be, he had sent Kodir of Kolvolt to destroy Houndstooth and Boba Fett. Of course, we know that Kodir didn't exactly do that, and that's because she's got her own designs. You know that whole song and dance back in Slave Ship when Kodir had sided with Quat against Kos of Nylon? It turns out she'd been using that scheme for her own ends. Fanald, the former head of security for KDY, and once a trusted confidant of Quat, had betrayed him not because he was in Kos's pay, but in Kodir's. It had all been a performance to allow her to win Quat's trust. In fact, before being sent out in pursuit of Fett and the Houndstooth, Kodir had met with Fanald, ostensibly to reward him for his service, in reality to give him a quick cut across the throat. No loose ends, am I right? Instead of returning immediately to KDY headquarters upon arrival in the Kuat system, Kodir instead goes to meet with the commander of Scavenger Squadron and a newly arrived attaché from the Rebel Alliance. She presents them with the evidence that Kuat had fabricated against Shizor, false evidence intended to divert the attention of Luke Skywalker, the Rebel Alliance's big damn hero, as a way of convincing them that Kuat is very clearly not going to be on their side in the war with the Empire, all the while professing her own sympathies for freedom and liberty. It doesn't take long for the rebels to decide that they have no problem with having Quat of Quat removed and someone more sympathetic to their cause in his place. Because this has been Kodir's plan all along. Get close to Quat and then, using the rebels as allies and possibly even patsies, eliminate him and take over Quat Drive Yards herself. And if the Empire wins at Endor, Kodir will likely have no compunction with selling her allies up the river. But this time, she and the rebels have underestimated Quat of Quat. The moment he receives reports that Kodir did not in fact kill Fett as ordered, Quat's suspicions are aroused, and using highly sophisticated surveillance technology that the rebels are unaware of, he's able to listen in on their discussion with Kodir and thus learns of her treachery. Knowing that he now has a viper at his proverbial breast, and with his back against the wall, Quat of Quat prepares a final countermeasure. He'd always known and feared the day would come when someone, most likely Palpatine, would try to take KDY away from him. And so he'd prepared a final countermeasure. The massive shipbuilding facilities of KDY, ringing the planet Quat like a circle of Durasteel, has been rigged with high-powered explosives and radiation bombs. Quat intends that there shall be no resource, technological or human, for any would-be usurper to take advantage of. It is the ultimate act of denial. Kind of like how in Atlas Shrugged when the industrialists that side with John Galt destroy their businesses rather than let them be nationalized by the government. Only they didn't go so far as to also massacre their employees. Quat of Quat had spent most of his professional life trying to keep KDY, his family's business, out of the hands of a Sith Emperor and the greatest crime lord in the galaxy. He will be damned before he will let it fall into the hands of petty schemers like Kodir of Kolvolt and her rebel friends. Speaking of Kodir, after her little meeting with the rebels, she goes in for a talk with Neela. Only for Neela to reveal that her seeing Kodir aboard the Houndstooth has finally unlocked the last of her memories. She not only knows now that she is Katil of Kolvolt, but that Kodir is her sister. Kodir had tried to get her in on the scheme to overthrow Quat of Quat, but Katil, loyal to the status quo, had refused, which of course meant she'd had to be eliminated. But Kodir had had just enough sisterly sentimentality left to have her mind wiped instead of killed. The plan had been to hire Reed Dupton to abduct Catil and transport her to a specialist that would do the job properly. That had been Kodyr's first mistake. Reed Dupton, a cheapskate who could barely be bothered to keep his own ship in working order, had given Catil over to a less qualified specialist. Thus, the memory wipe had been thorough, but not complete. Of course, now, on the cusp of finally getting what she wants, Kodyr has no room left for sentimentality and is about to shoot her sister and eliminate the threat for good and all. But after all those months, or years, surviving the horrors of Jabba's palace and her brief sojourn with Fett and Dengar, Catil has picked up a few tricks that her sister doesn't know. Recall that in Slave Ship, she was fast enough and deft enough to actually palm one of Boba Fett's pistols. With the help of the element of surprise, she's definitely more than fast enough to get the drop on Kodyr and subdue her, right at the moment that Kuat begins initiating the self-destruct protocols. After the first explosion, the rebels quickly figure out what's up, and Scavenger Squadron scrambles, hoping to get to the Star Destroyers and fly them out of the dry dock before they are destroyed along with it. Fett and Dengar arrive in system aboard the Houndstooth at the exact same time, and Fett remains utterly undeterred by the destruction unfolding before him. He has a date with Kuat of Kuat. For Dengar, however, this is a line too far. Flying into near suicide is not exactly what he signed up for. Right after the Houndstooth reaches the dry dock facilities and Fett steps off, Dengar declares their partnership finished and flies the Houndstooth away, only to then crash into a piece of spinning wreckage from the first explosion. Cruel irony indeed. Fett does indeed track down and confront Kuat of Kuat aboard one of the Star Destroyers, a fitting place for the industrialist to meet his end. The confrontation is actually somewhat anticlimactic, as Fett already has figured out most of what's going on for himself and has only confronted Kuat to confirm whether or not his suspicions are true. He knows about the fake evidence against Shizor. Although Catil doesn't know, Fett has by now figured out for himself who she really is and her connection to Kodyr. The fact that Kodyr of Cobalt had studiously made no reaction to seeing her sister aboard the Houndstooth was enough to convince Fett that she at least knew about the mind wipe scheme. Kuat assures him that he had no knowledge of Kodyr's plan, and indeed he didn't. Fett then reveals that in the fake evidence against Shizor, he'd found a security code that he was able to trace to Fenald, Kuat's former chief of security. Likely a backdoor insurance policy that would have allowed Fenald to blackmail his employer at some later date. If Kuat was indeed unaware of Catil's kidnapping and mind-wiping, Fett then surmises that Kodyr must have been the instigator, and that Fenald must have been her go-between. Fenald, who had then used Nil Posendum to hire Reed Dupton to kidnap Catil, using Kudar Mubat as the intermediary. Above all else, Fett confirms for himself that once Kuat is dead, there will be no more loose ends that he will have to worry about concerning KDY. No more new enemies to worry about, just the ones that he already has. Of course, that won't do him much good if the explosions consuming Kuat Drive Yard's shipyards take him with them. And so, Fett forces Kuat off the bridge and intends to fly the Star Destroyer out himself, something that Kuat claims is impossible. A Star Destroyer is just too big for one man to fly solo. But it doesn't matter. Kuat had reconciled himself to death. Exactly where doesn't matter. And so he disembarks and sits in a shed on the dry dock of KDY and awaits for the end. His only companion, his pet Felix, who'd followed him from his office. Meanwhile, Scavenger Squadron is pretty despondent. As Kuat had said, no ordinary man could fly a Star Destroyer out of the dry dock solo, and so at best they'd manage to rescue a few starfighters and Lancer-class frigates. But of course, Boba Fett is anything but ordinary. And as the rebels watch in stunned disbelief, the Star Destroyer not only gets underway, but its turbo lasers activate and it manages to shoot its way past any obstacles that would have otherwise been fatal. What's more, given that the explosions destroying KDY are in a linked circuit, including the Star Destroyers, Fett's piloting it out of the dry dock breaks the circuit and ends up leaving at least 80% of KDY's shipyards intact. Boba Fett, coolest and deadliest bounty hunter of all, does it again. For the most part, it's all's well that ends well. By the end of it, the word is beginning to spread. The Battle of Endor is over, and the rebels, incredibly, have won the day. A confused Dengar regains consciousness aboard not the Houndstooth, but his own personal ship, the Punishing One. Manaru, his beloved fiancée, had just arrived in the Kuat system to see him crash Houndstooth into that bit of wreckage. And she'd managed to get him off the ship and in one piece. But the good news doesn't end there. You see, Manaru was the woman who had approached Dramas Smada with that gambling wager. She'd wagered that Dengar would survive his partnership with Boba Fett. She'd gambled everything they'd had between them, as well as incurring massive loans for the wager. But now that she's won, there's enough money between them to finally pay off Dengar's debts, and even enough to start up whatever business they might want for themselves. Dengar is a free man. He doesn't have to be a bounty hunter anymore. To his own surprise, Dengar finds himself regretting that fact. Maybe he isn't ready to quit the business after all. But that's something to worry about later. For now, he's alive, he's free, and he's got his beloved with him. For now, that's enough. Meanwhile, another woman is having a final meeting with another bounty hunter. Kodir of Kolvolt has been sent to Kuat in chains to stand trial for conspiracy, kidnapping, and murder, while Katil has received a message to meet with Boba Fett aboard his commandeered Star Destroyer. The two swap information, although at this point they've both figured out everything independently, so there's not much to learn. Or at least there isn't until Katil questions why Fett went to all that trouble just to confront Kuat and confirm everything that he knew, especially everything concerning her kidnapping and mind-wiping. Fett admits that he did it partially for her sake. After all, she did save his life back on Tatooine, and Fett always repays his debts, but there was a more self-serving motive as well. And admittedly, I don't really like this because it feels really left field. Fett reveals that en route to Kadar Mubat's web, he'd been contacted by Black Sun. The criminal organization has been locked in a civil war ever since Shizor's death, and one of the factions had contacted Fett with an offer he couldn't refuse. Either find and give them the evidence that Kuat of Kuat had fabricated against Shizor, or they'd hunt him down and kill him. And apparently Black Sun is to Fett what the IRS is to the Joker.
I'm crazy enough to take on Batman, but the IRS? No, thank you.
And so he's willing to make a deal with Katil. He's willing to give her the Star Destroyer he got out of the dry dock. It would definitely put her in good standing with the Rebel Alliance. They might even back her to be the next leader of KDY now that Kuat is dead. In exchange, he wants the Houndstooth so that he can fly out of the system under his own power, the fake evidence against Shizor, and her silence about his continued survival. For now, he still considers it more to his advantage if everyone else thinks he's dead. Sure, Bosk, Balance Sheet, Sulak, and some of the lowlifes from Mos Eisley know he's still breathing, but such people are rarely considered by respectable galactic society. Katil of Kolvolt accepts, and as she watches the bounty hunter walk off the ship and out of her life, she thinks back to when she'd first found him half digested and dying in the sands of Tatooine, and she finds herself thinking that she's still not sure if it might have been better if she'd left him there. And with that, the story of the Bounty Hunter Wars ends, but life in the Star Wars universe would go on. Katil would indeed be made chairwoman of KDY, but that was completely irrelevant at that point. After Endor, the Imperial Remnant determined to seize direct control of KDY just as Kuat of Kuat had always feared. And though the Rebel Alliance, later the New Republic, did indeed win control of Kuat, by then the shipyards had suffered so much damage from the multiple battles fought over it, as well as sabotage by Imperial partisans, that it would be years before KDY was back up to pre-Endor manufacturing capacity, leaving the New Republic desperately short of warships during events like the Thrawn campaign. In a way, Fett did indeed get his post-Endor ideal scenario. The war between the New Republic and the Imperial Remnant would drag on for another 15 years, only ending with the signing of the Pelion-Gaversom Treaty. For what my opinion is worth, I think Jeter's Bounty Hunter Wars trilogy deserves the canon verdict. It does have its faults, like the slow pacing issues in part of Slave Ship, but for the most part, its positives far outweigh the negatives. Given that it's a Star Wars Underworld story, there are plenty of dirtbags that are fun to read about and fun to hate. Surprisingly, though, I actually found myself sympathizing with Quat of Kuat and Bosk of all beings. I guess it's because compared to some of the enemies that he had to deal with, like Kodir and Kos, Kuat came off as more likable than they. Whereas with Bosk, it was always funny to watch him get outwitted by Fett. And even when he finally did manage to score a small victory, my sympathy for him was more along the lines of, "Aw, the dog finally learned not to poo in the house. Good for you." Ironically, the Bounty Hunter Wars trilogy's greatest strength is also in a way its great weakness. Above all else, this is a showcase of Boba Fett's badassery, and it delivers on that in spades. But because Fett is so capable and hyper-competent, by the time he's fully recovered from the Sarlacc at the end of Mandalorian Armor, he ends up relegating Katil and Dengar to essentially little more than non-entities. At least with Katil, there is the struggle to regain her memories, and she does manage to get one over on Kodir at the climax. Poor Dengar pretty much becomes irrelevant once Fett takes charge of the situation. Overall though, if you're someone unfamiliar with Star Wars, if you've heard tell of this thing called the Expanded Universe and that it might be better than what Disney's been doing with the property these days, I'd say this is definitely worth a read, especially if you're a Boba Fett fan. Until then. Before there was Ellen Ripley. Before there was Wonder Woman. There was the original action heroine, Atalanta. Now available in ebook, paperback, and audio form. Links in the description.